Title: Grain and Silence, A Baker's Evening by the Nile, 1240 BCE. The Nile is golden now. Not the fierce gold of noon, but the soft, sinking hue of an evening about to exhale. Along the riverbank, reeds rustle in a breeze grown tired from a long day, and herons take to their perches. The village of Permedjat, small and ancient, leans gently into the coming dusk. Its houses of mud brick, sun-cracked and low, hold in their walls the warmth of the day. A calmness settles over everything, like flour dust floating down after a long shift. Within the outer edge of the village, not far from the weaving huts and date presses, stands the bakery. It is modest, shaped by hand and heat, its domed oven built from clay and straw long hardened by countless firings. The front of the shop is open to the path, shaded by woven reed matting, with a low wooden bench for those who wait or gossip. The scent that hangs in the air is unmistakable, warm bread, nutty and ancient, mixed with the faint tang of wood smoke. Inside, the baker is finishing his day. His name is Pa Sobek, and he has been at this for decades. His linen tunic is damp with effort, a smear of ash on one cheek. In the glow of the hearth, his eyes seem to reflect embers. He moves with the practiced calm of someone who has long since stopped measuring time in hours, and instead counts by trays of loaves and the hiss of steam when dough meets heat. Tonight, he is making the last batch, small round loaves for the neighbors who come after the fields, and a few flat rounds to take home. His daughter, Merit, sits on a low stool beside the grinding stone. She has nearly finished the emmer wheat, her hands ghosted with flour, her braids tied back with rush twine. The sound of stone on stone is steady, soothing. Outside, the light turns amber, then rose. The villagers begin their slow walk back from the fields. Children chase each other past the edge of the palms, and a dog barks once before curling near a cooking hearth. A woman in a blue shawl stops to greet Pa Sobek, exchanging a nod before handing over a small pouch of dates for tomorrow's order. Inside the bakery, heat radiates from the oven. Pa Sobek slides a long paddle beneath the cooling loaves, turning them gently. A crack forms on the crust of one, releasing a scent that fills the room like memory. He places it on a woven tray lined with papyrus, and Merit reaches for it to brush off a bit of ash. They do not speak, but the silence is comfortable. It is the silence of dough that has risen as expected, of the day winding down without complaint. And then the wind shifts, just slightly, bringing with it the scent of river and fish and the faint perfume of lotus from someone's garden pool. Pa Sobek looks toward the door. The light outside is nearly gone, replaced by the long violet breath before nightfall. He wipes his hands on a cloth and nods to Merit. They both understand, it is time to close, to let the heat settle, to honor the quiet that follows work. As they begin stacking the baskets and sealing the flour jars, a neighbor lingers at the threshold, eyeing the remaining bread. Pa Sobek gestures gently, handing over a loaf with a nod. No coins exchange hands tonight, just a murmured word of thanks and a promise to return a borrowed tool. The oven gives a soft sigh as a last coal collapses inward. The village is turning in, slowly, softly. In this hour of fading light, the baker's work is nearly done. But the warmth remains, in the walls, in the loaves, in the gentle weight of routine passed down through the generations. And in the hush that falls, one can almost hear the grain itself, whispering its gratitude. The late afternoon sun cast long ochre shadows across the village, and the Nile's soft whisper drifted on the breeze. From the low mud brick houses came the scent of date syrup and damp rush mats, but in the baker's courtyard, it was flour that ruled the air. Fine, pale dust clung to the walls and the folds of linen robes, painting everything in a soft, silent white. Kenti, the baker, was bent low beside the grinding stone. His shoulders moved in steady rhythm as he worked the saddle quern, grain against stone, the rasping grind familiar as breath. Every few strokes, he paused to wipe his brow with the back of his wrist, leaving a smear of flour on his dark skin. The emmer wheat was coarse this year, husk stubborn, but the grind could not wait. Bread was owed to the temple. Bread was owed to life. Behind him, his daughter Iset laid palm baskets in a neat row along the clay bench. Some held roasted barley, others, salted dried figs for tomorrow's baking. Her eyes followed her father's movements, but her hands moved with practiced speed, dusting flour from the lip of each vessel with a reed brush. Iset had grown up in the rhythm of bread, in the language of waiting heat and measured water. She knew when dough was too eager or too slow, when flour was tired, or when the wind carried just enough Nile mist to make the loaves swell high. A shout came from beyond the courtyard wall, laughter, boys splashing in the shallows. The sound was old as reeds. Kenty did not turn. He only shifted to pour the new flour into a deep clay bowl, his hands careful, reverent. From the roof, where straw was laid out to dry, a pigeon cooed. The sun's angle now fell through the open door of the baking room. Within, shadows trembled across the domed oven, its clay sides warm but not yet lit. The wood for tonight's fire was stacked carefully beside it, dried sycamore twigs, tamarisk bark, a bundle of palm midribs. A gift from the potter's son. Barter still worked when Silver did not. Iset moved inside, pausing by the small niche where they kept their leaven wrapped in linen. It was alive, faintly sour, bubbling softly in its nap. She unwrapped it and murmured to it, as her mother had done. Bread was not made from flour and water alone, it required patience, the hush of evening, the right breath of the gods. Outside, Kenty stood, stretching his back. His hands were white to the wrists. From the corner of the courtyard, their old cat leapt onto a bench and yawned, tail flicking in the flower haze. Time here was slow and circular. It was not marked by bells or scribes, but by the color of dough, the scent of yeast, the length of a shadow on a wall. A neighbor passed by and called a greeting. Kenty answered without looking up. This was a quiet hour, between labor and fire, between sunlight and the first stars. It was the hour when the world held its breath. The river, always near, always murmuring, sent a gust of cooler air through the alleyway. It stirred the hanging cloth at the doorway and brushed Iset's cheek. She closed her eyes for a moment. Tonight's loaves would feed the fisherman, the priest's apprentice, the blind woman with the copper anklets. Bread was more than bread. It was offering, story, silence. In a few more minutes, the fire would be lit. The sky deepened, shifting from the warm dust of gold to the soft indigo that foretold night. A single star blinked above the palms, perhaps Sopdet, the bringer of floods, or perhaps only a wandering light lost to memory. In the baker's courtyard, Kenty knelt before the oven like a priest before an altar. He struck the flint carefully, his fingers calloused and sure. The dried midribs of palm frond caught the spark with a sigh, a breath barely louder than a whisper. Smoke spiraled upward in thin blue ribbons. Fire in this place was always coaxed, never commanded. It needed patience, a calm voice, and hands that did not rush. The wind might steal it, the ash might sulk, but tonight the flame agreed to rise. The oven, tall, round-bellied, patched from seasons of cracks and care, began to warm. Its surface glowed faintly orange in the encroaching dusk. Iset stepped outside carrying the wrapped leaven, now softened and warm with life. She paused near the small bench where a stone jar of water waited, its mouth covered with linen to keep out dust and spirits. She dipped her hands in the coolness, then unwrapped the linen carefully. Her hands smelled of earth and vinegar and thyme. Kenty watched the oven, listening. The fire crackled now with the voice of old wood. He touched the side of the dome, gauging its readiness by feel alone. There were no dials, no weights or scales. Only memory. Only skin and breath. Together, father and daughter moved in silence. In the mixing basin, the flour waited in still heaps like dunes in the desert. The water joined with a soft splash, then the leaven, poured like a blessing. Isette folded it in slowly, her arms steady and slow, pushing the dough against the clay bowl's curved belly. She murmured a soft rhythm, not words exactly, but the hush-hum sound her mother once made when kneading in the dark days of morning. The dough resisted, then yielded. Like all things alive. Outside the gate, a donkey brayed. The sound echoed briefly in the quiet lane before fading into the rustle of reeds. The cat, now curled near the oven, twitched one ear and stretched a paw but did not wake. Kenty returned to the fire. He fed it in careful handfuls, never too much at once. Fire was greedy. It must be made to wait. He watched as flames licked the oven walls, then leaned back against the plastered courtyard wall, eyes tracing the familiar cracks where a creeping vine once grew. His breathing slowed. Within the oven's dome, the heat gathered like a held breath. It would not be long now. Isette shaped the loaves, small rounded ones with pinched tops, flat discs with thumbprints, long ovals scored with a reed comb. Some were for neighbors. Some for offerings. A few were marked with small clay seals bearing the name of the household, pressed just deep enough to hold in the bake. Even bread had an identity. Even dough held memory. She laid the loaves on palm fiber trays dusted with ground barley husk. The shapes caught the fading light, pale and soft, almost sleeping. Kenty tested the oven again, then with a practiced sweep of the long wooden paddle, brushed away the coals, scattering them into a narrow trench dug beside the oven's base. There, they would rest like sleeping embers until morning, when the first heat of day would call them back. The oven was ready. Isette moved to her father's side, the trays in her arms. Together, they began to slide the loaves inside, one by one, the paddle's curved edge guiding each gently onto the hot clay. A hush settled over them as the bread met fire. Not a hiss, but a sigh. The first alchemy of flour and flame. Kenty nodded. His eyes, so rarely expressive, softened. He watched as his daughter's hands moved surely, confidently, her own now, no longer needing his guidance. The same fire his father once taught him to tend now warmed her face. Night pressed softly around the courtyard, bringing with it the scent of sweet smoke and distant river. Somewhere in the fields, a flute played. A lullaby, perhaps. Or the echo of one. The kindling hour was ending. The baking hour had begun. The shadows deepen as the sun continues its descent behind the western hills, gilding the sky with crimson and ochre. In the bakery's small courtyard, the last of the sunlight catches the edges of clay jars and wicker baskets, painting their curves in bronze light. A hen scratches idly near the base of the wall, pecking at spilled grain that had escaped earlier during the sifting. Her quiet clucking is one of the few sounds left, aside from the gentle rustling of the reeds just beyond the fence. Inside, the heat of the day clings stubbornly to the thick mud brick walls, but the mood shifts toward a slower pace. The bakery is quieter now, with the day's work mostly done. The air smells of cooled ash and warm flour, and only the soft patter of sandals can be heard as Nennefer returns with her small brother, Rennie, in tow. He holds a crumpled reed doll, its limbs frayed from constant handling, and his thumb rests in his mouth until Nennefer gently nudges it away. She smooths his hair and guides him toward a low bench. Their mother, Isette, sits nearby on a reed mat, weaving palm fiber into a small tray. Her fingers move with practiced ease. Though her back aches, she finds a calming rhythm in the repetition. She glances up now and again, keeping an eye on the fire pit at the courtyard's edge where a pot of lentils simmers slowly, scented with garlic and fenugreek. It's a modest meal, meant to stretch, but it is warm and filling, and her children will eat well tonight. Inside the bakery chamber, old Seneb finishes sweeping the corners. The soft hiss of the broom's bristles along the floor echoes faintly, a soothing sound amid the growing silence. He pauses at the threshold and peers out at the fading sky. Evening is falling fast, and soon the lamps will need to be lit. He moves to the shelf, selects a small clay oil lamp, and fills it from a sealed jar. A short wick is twisted and inserted, and when lit, its glow flickers gently against the walls, casting elongated shadows. The hearth, which once roared with flame, now holds only dull embers. The massive dome of the baking oven, its outer wall still warm, radiates a slow, fading heat. A few remaining loaves lie cooling on a linen cloth. Round, golden, lightly scored. The scent is faint now, but still comforting. Seneb picks up one loaf and gently taps its crust with the edge of his knuckle. It gives the hollow sound he listens for. Baked well. No need to rush these to the stall, they'll be sold at morning's first light. Beyond the bakery walls, the village grows quieter too. Voices of neighbors call softly in farewell or prayer. Farther off, a cow lows, a heron croaks from the water's edge, and the breeze carries the faint scent of river silt and wild papyrus. Rennie points upward, to a bat flitting above the roof's edge. Aset smiles, reaching to place her palm on the boy's chest. He chases the stars, she says, half in story, half in truth. It's a tale told often, one that will follow him into dreams. Inside again, Nennefer lights two more lamps and places one near the kneading trough, the other near the doorway. Their amber glow warms the cullining chamber. She helps Seneb fold the spare cloths, stack the unused baskets, and brush off the floured table. These acts of tidying are rituals, as vital as the mixing and shaping, gestures of care for the space and the day that has passed. When the chores are done, the family gathers beneath the archway to eat their lentils and share soft pieces of broken bread. No one speaks much. The silence is not hollow, it is soft, filled with presence, like the stillness of the Nile at dusk. The old baker leans back against the wall, chewing slowly, his gaze drifting toward the stars just now pricking the sky. And so, with bellies warmed and hands at rest, the evening deepens. In the small bakery by the Nile, silence is not absence. It is peace. It is presence. It is the breath between day and night, between fire and darkness, between the grain and the dream. The last of the dough is shaped with practiced grace, rough hands smoothing its surface with soft reverence. In the heart of the clay bakery, the temperature has risen, the fire, banked since midday, now roars gently within the domed ovens. The air smells of hot earth and faintly sweet grain. Tamar leans forward, lips pursed, watching the golden crusts forming just beyond the fire's breath. The evening bake is different than the morning one. Less hurried, more reflective. The bread now is for the priests, the temple guards, or those whose errands run late. It is darker, denser, often made with spiced lentils or date paste folded into its center. These loaves will be wrapped in linen, placed in baskets, and carried across the temple courts under a cooling sky. Outside, the day's warmth lingers in the bricks, but the sky has softened to lavender. A breeze lifts the scent of ash and barley, mingling it with the fragrance of flowering lotus drifting from the canal. Tamar steps beyond the doorway for a breath of air. Her linen robe clings to her skin, damp with the day's labor, but the wind begins to ease it. Children race along the edge of the courtyard, their laughter echoing against sandstone. A boy calls out that his mother awaits her bread, and Tamar waves him off with a smile, knowing the loaves need a little longer still. There is rhythm to this, the quiet pulse of timing, the knowledge that one cannot rush heat or grain. It is a lesson learned over decades. She returns to the fire, lifting the curved bronze peel to turn the loaves. Steam rises as she moves them, each one holding a different scent: cumin, carob, wild honey. There are symbols pressed into the tops of a few, offerings for the local deity, whose shrine overlooks the granaries nearby. Tamar's own grandmother taught her those marks, saying they were read like prayers by gods and spirits alike. The final trays are placed on the cooling shelves, broad, smooth planks supported by clay jars. Tamar fans them gently with a woven palm frond, coaxing the heat away while preserving the crust. She sets aside 2 of the most beautiful loaves, wrapping them with care. These are for the overseer, who expects not only perfection but devotion folded into every bite. From the back storeroom, she gathers rush baskets for delivery. Each is lined with clean cloth, its edges tucked like swaddling. She works silently, the same way she once watched her mother do, tying cords and checking each loaf like a mother counting fingers and toes. A broken crust is gently removed and replaced. A smear of soot is brushed away with a corner of linen. As she finishes, she hears a quiet voice at the doorway. It is her sister, pale from the temple's shade, holding a small oil lamp and a folded papyrus. Tamar steps forward, brows rising. There is news: the eldest of the priests has passed on, and an offering of bread must be sent before sunrise. Tamar nods solemnly, understanding at once. Another batch must be begun, this one without salt, with coriander and fenugreek, shaped in the likeness of doves. She does not sigh, does not complain. Instead, she lifts the grindstone once more, and her sister kneels beside her. Together they begin to press the last of the grain, their movements slow and reverent. The fire must be tended again, the oven's mouth cleared of ash. Tamar sets aside the baskets, rolls up her sleeves, and reaches for the flour jar. The moon has risen now, faint above the palm trees. The evening is no longer an ending, but a quiet continuation. In this small clay bakery by the Nile, the rhythm of grain and silence flows on, ancient, sacred, unbroken. The soft chime of the entry bell echoed once more, then fell silent. Outside, the gaslight flickered behind misted panes, its glow gently distorted by the sheen of condensation clinging to the glass. The world beyond the post office seemed suspended, London's clamor reduced to muffled hoofbeats and the occasional rattle of cartwheels over cobblestones slick with drizzle. Within, all was quiet. Mr. Edwin Harrow, assistant postmaster, stood still as a statue at the central sorting table. His sleeves were rolled precisely to the elbow, revealing forearms dusted faintly with grey powder from the chalky sacks of incoming mail. His spectacles had slipped slightly down the bridge of his nose, but he made no effort to adjust them. Instead, he simply watched. Watched as the final sack was lowered to the stone floor with a soft grunt and the door to the outer yard thudded shut behind the last delivery boy of the evening. A sigh passed through the quiet room. It was not of weariness, but of transition. The hour had come, the time for sorting. The ritual. It began with the candles. Though the post office was fitted with electric lights, they remained off. Harrow disliked their sharp flicker and the unnatural hum they emitted. For this hour, for this work, he preferred the gentle halo of flame. A row of stubby tallow candles stood ready along the far shelf. He lit them one by one, their small wicks flaring reluctantly before settling into soft orange glows. Shadows stretched out from the corners of drawers and alcoves, no longer banished but gently ushered into shape. He returned to the table and began untying the mail sacks, thick canvas stained from years of use, each with a polished brass tag clinking faintly against its corded drawstring. The labels read like verses in a litany: Russell SQ, 6:15 p.m. Wapping Station, 6:20 p.m. CHSWICK, Evening RUNDDUNSTABLE, Inward Train, 5:30. Each sack was emptied with care, the envelope spread out in neat fans like cards in a patient game. Some bore wax seals, others red ink stamps. A few were marked "Per Express," the letters slanted and impatient, as though hurrying their own passage. Others were so faintly addressed, just a name, no street, no borough, that Harrow knew they would end the night unanswered, returned, or puzzled over by morning light. The sound of paper filled the room. Rustling, shifting, like the stirrings of small wings. 1,000 whispers folded into parchment. The scent of ink, aged, sharp, slightly metallic, hung in the air. Harrow moved through it all with methodical grace, placing each piece into wooden trays set before him, sorted first by region, then by street, and then, most delicately, by hand. He could tell, by touch alone, which were written in haste and which in sorrow. The heavy envelopes with foreign stamps spoke of ports and promises. The thin blue papers, crinkled, almost transparent, often came from boys in uniform, writing from barracks or outposts. One letter bore smudged fingerprints across the corner. Another was edged in black, the morning border faded but unmistakable. Harrow paused over that one. He did not read it, never did, but he held it for a moment longer than the others, then placed it gently in the tray marked, Clerkenwell, Domestic. Behind him, the great wall of pigeonholes loomed, its hundreds of cubby-sized compartments waiting in silence. Most were labeled with brass tags, others chalked hastily for temporary rerouting. It was an architecture of order, a cathedral of communication built not with stone and mortar but paper and patience. He began filling them, one by one. There was comfort in it. A quiet certainty. Each letter found its place. Each note, its destination. There were no speeches here, no noise, no haste. Just the steady rhythm of paper sliding into wood. Occasionally, Harrow would hum, low, almost inaudible, a tune from some distant childhood, long since dulled by time. The room did not echo back, it only listened. By the time the tower clock struck 7, he had moved on to the second sack. His fingers, though aged, remained deft. They moved not like a machine's, but like a ritualist's, precise, reverent, unhurried. In this chamber of dim candlelight and whispering pages, there was no need to rush. Morning was still a distant promise. The world could wait a little longer, and so the sorting continued, in silence. The marketplace, though quiet now, still holds the scent of the day. Faint traces of coriander, dried fish, and palm wine linger in the warm air. The shadows of canopy poles stretch long across the packed earth, and baskets that once brimmed with lentils and barley now lie empty or overturned. Along the periphery, stray cats patrol the food stalls, slipping silently between worn clay pots and sun-faded reed mats. Men and women gather in small knots near the bakery's edge. Some wait for the last of the day's loaves, others simply come to talk, their hands gesturing softly as the hush of dusk wraps around them. Among them is a midwife wrapped in a dark indigo shawl, speaking quietly with a neighbor about a difficult birth. Another man, sun-darkened and barefoot, carries a woven tray of fish wrapped in lotus leaves, nodding in greeting as he passes. Inside the bakery, the rhythm quickens. Pashet, the young assistant, moves with practiced haste. She sweeps the flour from the wooden bench, wipes the clay trough with damp cloth, then returns to the dough. Her hands, thin but steady, press the mixture into neat balls, each one destined for the domed oven. Though her brow is damp with effort, she does not pause. Beside her, Tay's husband Janu fans the embers with a bundle of reeds, coaxing a steady red glow from the hearthstones. The dome of the oven is blackened with soot, but the fire inside flickers gold and crimson, licking at the curved walls. Occasionally he adjusts a shard of pottery resting atop the oven's mouth, using it to reflect heat back into the clay dome. It is not elegant, but it works. The loaves, once shaped, are placed on long wooden paddles and slid into the heart of the oven. A few rise into round domes, while others are flattened into discs, ready for marking with sesame or fenugreek. The scent of baking bread begins to bloom, nutty, rich, and slightly sour, drifting through the small doorway and into the night beyond. In the corner, a shallow dish of lentil paste rests near the fire to keep warm. This will be the baker's supper, simple, sustaining. Nearby, a cloth-wrapped basket of preserved dates offers a touch of sweetness for later, after the last loaf is shaped and set to bake. Tonight, no great feast awaits them. Only this quiet, worn comfort. Outside, the Nile winds passed like a ribbon of dark silk, glinting with the light of stars just beginning to appear. The breeze from the river is soft now, barely stirring the papyrus reeds that line the bank. Somewhere in the distance, a heron calls once, then falls silent. The stillness deepens. At the bakery door, a child appears, a girl with short-cropped hair and a necklace of blue faience beads. She clutches a small clay token in one hand, her eyes wide with uncertainty. Tay smiles at her, gently wiping her hands on her tunic before kneeling. "Bread for your mother?" she asks softly. The girl nods. She hands over the token, an imprint of a lotus flower pressed into a lump of dried clay, marked earlier that day by the scribe at the granary. Tay takes it, examines the imprint, and selects a warm round loaf from a wicker basket beside the fire. She wraps it in palm fiber and gives it to the child, whose face softens with relief. "Walk carefully," Tay murmurs, and the girl disappears into the night, barefoot on the dusty path. Behind Tay, the dough continues to rise. Pashat turns it gently, dusting each piece with millet flour. The oven crackles low and even. Outside, the stars will overhead in their ancient rhythm, unchanged for generations. Within these walls, the rhythm of evening baking carries on, wordless, precise, and filled with the soft weight of routine. Bread is shaped, given, eaten. And so the night deepens, fragrant and slow. The old grindstone hums with a soft, rhythmic groan beneath the weight of stone and time. Its surface is scarred and pale, worn smooth by years of grain being crushed into powder. The hand of the baker's eldest daughter presses against the wooden handle, turning it slowly, steadily. She leans into it with the precision of experience, her arms strong from repetition, her eyes half-lidded in thought. This is not a task that requires words, only breath and motion. Outside, the evening winds begin to gather, stirring dust into little whirls along the path that leads down to the fields. The air smells faintly of dry grasses and the last heat from the sun-baked mud brick walls. A faint hush has settled in the courtyard, broken only by the quiet scraping of stone on stone and the distant murmur of geese near the water's edge. Within the low-ceilinged grinding room, the floor is coated in fine flour dust, pale and soft underfoot. In one corner, a small woven basket overflows with cleaned emmer grains, golden in the low light. They shimmer faintly, each kernel a promise of sustenance. As the grinding continues, the crushed flour gathers in a shallow clay basin, soft as silk when sifted through calloused fingers. The younger children have grown quiet now, watching from the doorway. One sits with his chin propped in his hands, eyes following the movement of the heavy stone. Another traces circles in the flower dust with a stick, lost in some imagined world. The hush between them is not boredom but reverence. They know this moment. They have seen it every evening of their lives, and it anchors them like the river anchors their land. A second woman joins the eldest daughter, her scarf knotted tightly over her braids. She carries a small clay jar filled with a weak honey solution and sets it beside the flower basin. There is no rush between them. They speak little, only a nod, and soon the rhythm doubles. Two women now, hands alternating at the handle, their breathing matched like a hymn. The soft grind, the scrape of flour being brushed into the bowl, the occasional tap of a clay jar, it becomes a kind of evening music. Outside the room, the baker himself moves quietly. He tests the fired clay oven with the back of his hand, noting the lingering warmth. Soon he will feed it again, dry branches, bits of straw, dried reeds from near the marsh edge. But not yet. First, the flour must be ready. First, the rhythm must complete. The grindstone seems to sigh under its labor, echoing the slow breath of the village itself. There are no clocks here, only the slow turn of the stone, the length of a shadow, the call of a heron across the field. The Nile is not visible from this room, but it is felt in every movement, in every grain crushed and every loaf shaped by hand. The river gives, and the people shape that gift into life. As the last of the grain is ground, the elder daughter lifts the flour basin with care. Her arms are dusted in white, and there is a thin crescent of flour on her cheek. She does not wipe it away. She carries the bowl outside, where the cooling evening air meets her skin like a blessing. The children scatter from her path, laughing softly, returning to their small games beneath the eaves. In this quiet rhythm, the grind of stone, the weight of flour, the silence between tasks, there is something more than labor. There is memory. There is inheritance. And there is peace. The stone rests now. The flour is ready. The fire will soon be fed. And the village settles a little deeper into the embrace of the Nile's twilight. A pale golden hush rests over the courtyard as dusk deepens, blurring the line between day and night. The last rays of sunlight glint off the Nile's surface far beyond the palms, and within the baker's home, preparations turn inward. Shadows grow long across the packed earth floor. It is time to wake the oven. The oven itself stands like a squat sentinel in one corner of the courtyard, a domed shape built from thick clay, smoothed and blackened by years of fire. Its mouth yawns low and wide, rimmed in soot. A faint breath of warmth still lingers from the last firing, but it is not enough. Bread demands flame, and flame demands patience. The baker kneels, his knees pressing into the dust, and sets to work. He arranges dried palm fronds, split reeds, and bark in careful bundles beside the oven's mouth. The air smells of earth and kindling. He picks up a small fire-starting kit, a piece of hard flint and a smooth-edged firestone, both worn by long use. With practiced hands, he strikes. Sparks fly, brief and bright in the gloom. A whisper of smoke curls upward from a bed of lint-like dried fibers, coaxed gently until the ember becomes flame. He feeds the fire as one feeds a child, bit by bit, carefully. The flames catch slowly, licking the dry fronds and then the thicker kindling. The light dances across his face, revealing lines etched by sun and sleep and flower. He does not look at the fire with awe, he looks at it with respect. The family gathers loosely nearby. The daughters sit with the clay bowls of flour, slowly mixing water and leaven, which has rested since morning in a small, covered pot. It is a sour-smelling mixture, alive with unseen breath. The girls stir in slow circles, their hands firm, their fingers white with dust. The dough thickens beneath their palms, heavy and yielding. One of the boys brings over a palm-wrapped bundle of salt and sprinkles it carefully across the mixture, under his sister's nod of approval. In the background, the younger children hum an old song, something about crocodiles and stars, half remembered and passed from older siblings to younger ones like a river reed set adrift. It twines into the work, making the moment feel both ancient and personal. As the fire strengthens, heat radiates outward, drawing insects and smoke into a dance along the courtyard's edges. The baker uses a flat paddle to spread the coals inside the oven's dome, creating an even ring of heat. He watches the glow, gauging its strength with a glance and the feel on the back of his hand. No thermometer will tell him what he already knows. This is a heat that speaks to him in quiet language, crackles, flickers, the way the clay darkens where it grows hottest. When the dough has been kneaded smooth and elastic, the eldest daughter pinches off rounds and flattens them between her palms, then shapes them on a dusted board. The discs are soft and pliant, still sticky in the center. She lays them on a reed mat to rest. Each round will be baked in turn, some plain, some with a touch of honey, others dusted with crushed coriander or nigella. The courtyard glows now with the orange pulse of the fire. It casts tall, flickering shadows along the wall and makes the clay oven look like a small sun in the night. The warmth draws the family near, not close enough to crowd the baker, but near enough to share in the ritual. This is a communal fire, and its heat is meant for many. Finally, the baker deems the oven ready. He sweeps the coals to the back and sprinkles a few drops of water on the floor, listening for the telltale hiss. The paddle lifts the first round of dough and slides it into place. The air fills with the scent of baking bread, sweet, warm, ancient. He does not speak as he works. The fire is his conversation partner now. Crackle. Hiss. Whisper. Each round bakes for mere minutes, then is pulled free, puffed and golden, edges just beginning to crisp. The daughters stack the warm loaves in a wide, shallow basket lined with linen. Around them, the night deepens. The firelight becomes the only sun. The stars have come out, unnoticed, above the courtyard, and the Nile flows quietly in the distance like a dream half remembered. And here, at the heart of it all, is fire and bread. Not ceremony, not spectacle, but the quiet culmination of grain and labor, of earth and breath. The fire beneath the bread holds more than warmth, it holds continuity. A line drawn in ash, linking one day to the next, and one life to the many who came before. A warm hush settles in the bakery as the evening deepens. Outside, the last of the ochre sun slips behind the palm-lined horizon, casting long, honey-colored shadows across the open courtyard. The Nile glints just beyond the edge of the fields, barely moving, its surface smooth as burnished copper. Inside the adobe walls, all motion slows to a rhythm both ancient and reverent. Beck, the baker, sits cross-legged on a reed mat, wiping the sweat from his brow with a square of linen. Around him, the mixing troughs are scraped clean, the last of the dough formed and tucked beneath linen wraps to rest. In this quiet interlude, before the fires are lit for baking, there is space, precious space, for breath and silence. His daughter, Epi, carries in a small clay jug of date palm water, its neck beaded with cool droplets from the covered well outside. She moves carefully, barefoot across the swept earth floor, her braided hair tucked neatly under a headcloth. Beck accepts the jug with a nod of thanks, the quiet affection between father and daughter needing no words. He drinks deeply, then offers it back. She sits beside him, watching the sky outside as the first star appears. Not far away, the leavening loaves begin their slow, silent expansion. A line of low baskets, each lined with papyrus or linen, cradles the sleeping dough. The mixture of barley and emmer, patiently worked by Beck's hands, is now coming alive. Traces of sour ferment dance through the air, yeast drawn from the very Nile breezes, from yesterday's dough, from 1,000 unrecorded bakings before this one. There is magic in the process, though Beck would never call it that. Only memory and practice, patience and warmth. He rises with a groan, joints stiff from kneeling. Eppie stands too, brushing dust from her tunic. Together, they step to the side chamber where the clay oven waits. Beck crouches and checks the fire pit. The embers from earlier are ash now, but he knows the ways of fire. He places thin twigs and a few chips of palm wood into the shallow cavity, coaxing it into breath once more. Eppie feeds the fire with dried chaff, her face lit orange by the growing light. The air is filled with the rustling crackle of flame meeting fuel, a sound older than language. The oven is not a large one, round and bellied like a pot turned on its side, but it is seasoned from years of use. Its walls are blackened, its mouth chipped, and yet it still bakes true. When the interior glows a dull red, Beck nods. It is nearly time. In the corner, their elderly neighbor, Manat, arrives with a bowl cradled in both hands. She brings her own dough, shaped into thick discs and covered with sesame seeds. It is an old understanding: Beck provides the fire, neighbors bring their bread to bake. A quiet barter, sealed with small greetings and long habits. Manat sets down her bowl and rests on a stool beside the door, her eyes misty with the firelight. As the dough nears readiness, Eppie inspects each basket, lifting the linen gently. She hums an old tune, one her mother used to sing. The sound fills the room like the scent of an herb, soft, grounding, unspoken but known. Soon the night will deepen and the bread will go into the oven, one by one, under Beck's practiced hands. But for now, there is no rush. Just the gentle rise of the loaves, the sigh of warm air, the crackle of the small fire. In this pause between preparation and creation, the bakery breathes. And in the stillness, the Nile beyond the wall continues its ancient flow, bearing time along with its silent current. The sun had dipped behind the ridge of western hills, casting long shadows across the village's baked mud walls. The air was no longer blistering, but warm and dry, carrying with it the faint scent of tamarisk blossoms and Nile silt. From her doorway, Nanu watched the colors shift in the sky, no longer gold, but a dusty lilac slowly deepening to the soft purple of dusk. A hush settled over the yard, as if the world itself were holding its breath. She moved with the familiarity of years, her sandals scuffing lightly across the earth as she approached the outdoor oven, a domed clay structure, rounded and soot-streaked from long hours of fire. It squatted beside a stone wall where chickens now roost, their rustling feathers barely audible beneath the growing quiet. Nanu crouched beside the oven and placed her palm against its flank, testing the heat still radiating from within. It was warm. Not searing as at midday, but enough. She reached for the wicker basket beside her, lined with linen and filled with rising loaves, flat discs of barley and emmer, brushed with oil and speckled with fennel seed. The dough had risen through the late afternoon while she shaped, smoothed, and blessed each one. Her fingers now lifted the first disc, the indentations of her thumbprints still visible along the edge. One by one, she began to feed them into the oven's open mouth, carefully leaning them against the inner clay walls using a paddle of palmwood. A small breeze rustled the tamarisk tree overhead, shaking loose a few pale flowers, which drifted down like faint thoughts into the yard. Nanu hummed softly, no song in particular, just a melody born from repetition. The rhythm of the baking had always been a kind of music: place the loaf, close the oven, wait and breathe. Turn the bread, check for browning. Tap the crust. Listen for that hollow sound that meant it was done. Behind her, a pair of boys darted past, laughing in whispers. Her younger son among them, most likely, trailing a scrap of linen as a cape. Nanu didn't turn. She smiled faintly, brushing an errant strand of hair from her cheek as she tended the next loaf. The days of scolding and chasing were behind her now. Evening was her own. The smell of bread, that warm, nutty scent, began to bloom from the oven's mouth. It mixed with the scent of tamarisk and earth, creating a perfume that spoke of quiet nourishment and long memory. The loaves puffed and darkened, their crusts hardening to a fine shell. She removed them carefully, balancing them on the woven mat nearby, their heat rising in gentle waves. Some were for supper, others for the neighbors. A few would be wrapped in leaves and taken to the shrine in the morning as offerings. And one, perhaps the smallest, would be given to the old man who sat outside the granary every morning, scratching marks into the dirt. He had once been a scribe, they said, or perhaps a priest. It didn't matter. Nanu always saved him a loaf. With the last bread placed and the oven's mouth sealed again with a slab of mud brick, Nanu sat back on her heels and exhaled. Her bones creaked. The yard around her dimmed slowly, the shadows long and soft. Crickets began to chirp from somewhere beyond the fence. A dog barked twice, distantly, then fell quiet. She sat in silence, palms on her knees, the heat of the oven gently warming her side. Not far away, the Nile rolled on, cool, dark, and eternal. By the time the sky has shifted to a soft indigo, the faint breeze curling in from the river brings with it the mingled smells of damp reeds, fish smoke, and something sweeter, the aroma of barley flour beginning to warm. A gentle hush has settled over the village. Children's laughter has dimmed, replaced by murmurs of evening prayers and the quiet rhythm of water jars being lifted and carried indoors. Within the low walls of Nebit's home, the heart of the oven begins to throb with life. Its dome, rounded like the curve of the desert dunes, glows faintly where the fire inside licks at the clay walls. Nebit crouches nearby, her movements unhurried, deliberate. She does not rush the fire. The gods dislike haste when it comes to bread, or so the old women always say. The spirit of the grain must awaken slowly, warmed, not startled. She adds more acacia twigs to the mouth of the oven. They catch quickly, crackling with a high-pitched hiss. The sweet, resinous scent rises. Her son, Hori, now sits nearby, watching the dance of flame through the open slot at the base of the hearth. He says nothing, as is his way in the evening, but Nebit knows his silence. He is thinking, absorbing. Learning by watching. She slides a flat slab of limestone near the oven's entrance and lays down the first round of dough, gently flattened by her palms. The edges rise just slightly. Within moments, the dough begins to blister from the heat, the outer skin tightening while the inside remains soft. She flips it with a curved stick, just once, then removes it, placing it on a reed mat with others waiting their turn. There is no clock to measure these minutes, only the sense of rhythm passed down from her own mother, and her mother before her. Nebit knows when a loaf is ready by scent, by color, by the subtle tension in the crust. Behind her, Hori has taken up the second ball of dough, trying to mimic the motion she made, stretching, flattening, shaping. It is misshapen, more oval than round. One edge is too thick. But Nebit says nothing. She gestures toward the hot stone, and he slides it on, his face catching the firelight as he leans forward. His hands tremble slightly with the effort not to burn himself, but the bread lands safely, beginning its own quiet transformation. From somewhere across the wall, the neighbors' voices drift in, two women singing softly while grinding lentils. Another rhythmic sound, a pestle rising and falling in a clay mortar. It is a village of rhythm, grinding, kneading, tending fire, sweeping, washing. Each action loops into the next, a quiet symphony of labor and patience. Outside, the breeze strengthens just enough to make the door curtain stir. A cat appears, stepping soundlessly into the fire-lit space, tail high and curious. Hori drops a crust near the wall without a word, and the cat accepts the offering with grace. The loaves pile higher now. Some are destined for the temple, others will be sold at the market boat when it arrives at dawn. A few are for their own evening meal, and 2 are set aside, warm and wrapped, to give to the midwife down the lane, whose daughter has just delivered a son. Nebbit brushes flour from her forearms. Her hands smell of earth and ash and rising grain. The oven murmurs softly, still warm but no longer roaring. The heat remains steady, measured and calm. It has taken years to learn that too much fire makes angry bread. Tonight's fire is humble. Generous. Hori lays another misshapen dough round onto the hot stone. Nebbit smiles to herself but says nothing. One day, his hands will know the rhythm too. A soft crackle from the oven hearth breaks the long quiet of the baking room. The stones that line the floor, darkened by decades of soot and heat, radiate a slow, steady warmth. The air smells of barley and heat. Of ash and grain. The sort of scent that clings to your skin, enters your lungs, and stays long after you've gone. Biquette leans over the edge of the domed clay oven, her tanar, and with a practiced flick of her paddle, guides a soft, flattened round of dough onto its heated surface. A second later, she seals the small opening with a clay slab, letting the enclosed heat take hold. In a few minutes, the bread will begin to puff, rising gently with pockets of air, crisping at the edges, turning golden where the fire touches it. She knows the sound of it by heart, the faint hiss of moisture meeting hot stone, the tiny crackle as the crust begins to form. Around her, the baking room glows with a soft amber haze. One oil lamp swings gently from a hook in the ceiling, casting slow, flickering shadows across the walls. Flour dust clings to the air, catching the light in suspended patterns like drifting motes. Despite the labor of the day and the closeness of the heat, there is a strange comfort here, as if the walls remember every loaf ever baked within them, and hold the warmth of generations. She moves quietly, checking the dough resting under damp cloths, running her fingers over its surface. It has risen well, better than yesterday's, and she nods to herself. From a low shelf, she takes a basket of dried fenugreek and sprinkles a few pinches into the next batch, the sharp scent mixing with the deeper perfume of baking bread. Another handful of nigella seeds follows. Little black stars that will stud the crust and crackle when bitten. The door to the bakery room opens a crack, and her son, Katie, peeks in. He carries 2 small clay jugs, one sloshing with water, the other filled with coarse ground barley flour. His face is flushed from the walk to the granary courtyard and back, and a few strands of hair stick to his brow. Biquette smiles softly and motions him forward. He places the jars beside her without speaking, as if wary of disturbing the rhythm of the place. He has watched her do this since he could walk, kneeling beside the oven, hands steady even in the heat, folding and shaping each loaf as though it were a sacred offering. Perhaps it is. In a world ruled by wind, sun, and river, what is bread but a kind of prayer? A hope that life will continue, that the stomach will be full, that the gods will not forget. He stays with her for a while, helping to sift the flour, holding the paddle while she checks the loaves. Every so often, she nods or murmurs approval. No loud praise, no fanfare. Just presence. Shared breath. A quiet closeness beneath the hush of firelight and stone. One of the finished loaves cools on a flat wooden tray nearby. Katie, after glancing at his mother, breaks off a corner and brings it to his mouth. The crust crackles faintly, and the inside is still soft, fragrant with spice and the faintest trace of honey. He smiles without words. She pretends not to notice, her hands already shaping the next round. Outside, the sun has dipped behind the acacia trees, and the shadows deepen to a velvet blue. But in this small space carved of clay and effort, the world is bright with heat and scent. Loaves multiply. Cracks open gently in the crust. Smoke curls lazily from the vent in the roof, and somewhere in the quiet rhythm of baking, between the shaping of dough and the smell of rising bread, Biquette finds a kind of peace. A stillness forged not of silence, but of small, sacred acts, repeated without end. The warm hush of the bakery courtyard shifts as the shadows draw longer, and golden light spills in at a soft slant, pooling like honey between the worn mud brick walls. In the still air, there is the delicate, floating shimmer of flour, rising, sifting, settling again in soft spirals. The sounds have faded, too. No longer the scrape of grinding stones or the splash of water, just the occasional soft rustle of palm fronds, and the distant cry of an ibis gliding down toward the riverbank. Inside the shade of the millhouse, Mena leans over the wide basket where the flour has been caught, lifting the fine linen cloth used for sifting. It is a piece of careful work, the weave chosen for its tightness, its ability to catch husk and grit. He gives it a gentle shake, and the air fills again with a fine, white fog, dancing in the last rays of sunlight that slip through the open shutters. This dust of grain, this breath of harvest, settles softly onto his skin, into his curls, into the folds of his tunic. His daughter, Aissette, watches from her small stool, chin in hand. She has been helping all afternoon, and now she rests in the dreamy silence that follows effort. Her fingertips are dusted white, and she makes lazy, swirling patterns in the flour scattered across the clay floor. Mena smiles at her, not with words, but with the crinkle of his eyes, the tilt of his head. He remembers his own youth, watching his grandfather perform the same rituals. The same basket, the same cloth, the same satisfaction in the evenness of the powder, the lightness of the sieve. Then as now, flour was not simply a product, it was a promise. A quiet contract between land and labor. A breath taken by earth, and exhaled by hands that knew how to shape it. Mena takes up the round wooden sieve, set with a coarser weave. He begins a steady movement, rotating and tapping it over a second basket. The flour passes through with gentle falls, leaving behind small pebbles, shards of chaff, the rare stubborn grain that refused to yield beneath the stones. Each pass of the sieve feels like the echo of waves. Round and round. Shake and still. Pour and breathe, the rhythm is soothing. It draws Aissette in again. She rises and comes to stand beside her father, watching closely. "May I?" she asks, reaching out. He places his hands over hers and guides the motion. She giggles at the tickle of flour on her palms, then focuses, mimicking his pressure, his patience. Together they sift, and the sounds that fill the room are small but comforting, the whisper of flour through linen, the creak of woven reed beneath their feet, the quiet hum of evening insects just beyond the shutters. Outside, dusk has begun to gather. The clay walls glow faintly orange, then pink, then soft ash gray. Somewhere on the breeze is the smell of river water and distant cooking fires. The first oil lamps have been lit in neighboring courtyards, and the light dances gently in clay saucers and bronze bowls. Aissette breaks the silence. "Will we bake tonight?" Mena nods. "Yes. The ovens still hold the heat from earlier. We'll shape the dough and set it in when the stars are out." She smiles, and in the golden haze of the millhouse, the past and future seem to meet, an unbroken chain of bakers and daughters, of soft flour and quiet hands. The basket fills with sifted, shining flour. Enough for the evening loaves, and perhaps a little extra for a neighbor who fell ill. Menna brushes the cloth clean and folds it with care. He glances once more at Iset, now humming softly to herself, her hands still dusty, her eyes bright with learning. The day may be ending, but the flour is ready. And that, in this simple home by the Nile, is more than enough. A soft hush settled over the back of the bakery, broken only by the occasional pop of oil in the clay lamp. The chamber was small, a recess off the main kitchen, with low walls of packed mud brick and a simple stone shelf pressed into one side. Here, Khepri often found a moment of stillness as the sun sank fully behind the fields and the world outside faded into shadow. The oil lamp cast a golden flicker across the earthen walls. Its flame swayed gently, throwing trembling shadows behind the rows of wooden tools and reed baskets stacked neatly along the shelf. Above, the smoke curled toward the low ceiling, faintly perfuming the room with the scent of the resin-soaked wick. Khepri wiped his flour-dusted hands on a damp cloth and lowered himself onto a smooth stone stool. He exhaled slowly, letting his back relax after hours hunched in heat and labor. Outside, the quiet chirp of night insects had begun to fill the silence, blending with the distant splash of water from an unseen oar. In the soft glow, he inspected a bundle of newly cut papyrus sheets laid on the bench. Though his primary craft was bread, his side trade, modest and occasional, was selling fine bread recipes and ceremonial grain blends to scribes or temple kitchens. A cousin in the temple quarter had once joked that Khepri's bread prayed better than most incense. He had laughed, but the compliment had stayed with him. He selected a small stylus and dipped it into a pot of thick ink. With slow care, he marked characters in flowing lines, for the moon feast of Ta, 1 part barley to 2 of wheat, mixed at dusk, left to rest through the night. His handwriting was not elegant, not like a temple scribe's, but it was steady and readable. He worked in silence, stopping only to blink or shift his weight. Across from him, the old wall shelf held small treasures, an ivory spoon passed from his mother, a clay amulet of Happy the Nile god, a fragment of painted faience once worn by a sister now gone. These were not riches, but they were anchors, each carrying memory, warmth, and the quiet solidity of time. When the script was complete, Khepri leaned back and rubbed the ache in his wrists. Outside, the sky had deepened to a velvety indigo. Somewhere to the north, a heron gave a sharp cry, then silence returned, thick and layered like the folds of a linen cloak. There was something sacred in this time of night, he thought, not the formal rituals of the priests, but the quiet moments after labor, when the world no longer demanded motion. He reached for a small dish of dried dates and nuts, chewing slowly as he stared into the flame. Each crackle, each flutter of shadow, felt like a reminder that stillness had a music of its own. Tomorrow would bring another round of rising dough, early heat, and orders shouted through the courtyard. But for now, the world had narrowed to this little room, this lamp, this hush. His breath slowed as he pressed his palms together in a silent gesture of gratitude, not to any single god, but to the rhythm of the Nile, the peace of bread baking, and the flickering comfort of quiet work done well. The flame danced a little higher, then lowered again, as if nodding in agreement. And Khepri, baker of grain and keeper of silence, smiled softly into the lamplight. Evening had deepened into night, though the heat of the day still lingered, caught in the mud brick walls and stone floors of the bakery like a breath unwilling to leave. The stars, slow to emerge, shimmered faintly above the rooftops as if testing the edge of the sky's darkness. One by one, the small domestic fires of the village were covered, their last flickers snuffed beneath pots or clay lids. But Khefri's oven still glowed, low, steady, like an ember cupped in a careful palm. The sound of approaching sandals, uneven and light, echoed down the alley just beyond the outer courtyard. Khepri paused in the act of kneading a final ball of dough, his hands glistening with oil and fine bran. He waited, listening. Then the outer door creaked. A voice, half breath and half whisper, "Baker Kefri?" The man smiled. "Come in, little one." The door opened further, and a boy stepped inside, thin, sharp-eyed, no older than 10 summers. He wore a short linen tunic that had once been white but now bore the stains of the temple yard, and a sash with the faint golden mark of the house of Ta embroidered at its frayed edge. In his hands, he clutched a wide reed tray, woven tightly with a curved rim and covered in a clean cloth. Kefri nodded gently, wiping his hands on a damp towel and walking over. "You are Senmut, yes?" The boy gave a nod, then bowed in a practiced temple manner, head low, eyes lowered, tray held outward with care. "My teacher sends this. The high priest requests the sun loaf and the barley cakes be delivered before the 4th hour of night. Tomorrow is the feast of the craftsman." Kefri unwrapped the cloth. Inside lay a handful of polished carnelian beads, a humble temple payment, and a tightly folded scrap of papyrus bearing a stamped seal. He gave a small chuckle. "Did they send you with the offering bowl, or just your feet this time?" Senmut smiled, the expression flashing across his face like a spark. "Just my feet, revered one." "Kefri is enough," the man said, kneeling to the boy's level. "I am no scribe." The bakery's air was warm and scented with grain and salt and the fading sweetness of dates. Kefri gestured toward the bench near the oven, and Senmut sat obediently, folding his legs beneath him. Kefri pulled a tray of partially risen barley cakes from a nearby shelf and began to shape them with care, his fingers pressing delicate lines across the top in the image of lotus blossoms. Each cake was small, but rich, made from flour sifted 3 times and soaked in palm wine before baking. These were not market loaves. These were for gods. "Do you know," Kefri said softly as he worked, "why the barley cakes must rest before baking?" Senmut tilted his head, thinking. "Because the yeast must wake?" Kefri smiled. "Yes. Even the air has memory, little one. The dough listens to the night. If you bake it too soon, it forgets how to rise." The boy watched silently, eyes wide, as Kefri placed the shaped cakes onto a wide ceramic platter. His hands moved like water, smooth and practiced. Each motion spoke of hundreds of nights like this one, quiet, smoky, and filled with a sense of sacred rhythm. Kefri bent to the oven, brushing aside a small pile of hot ash with a wet reed brush. The hearth's heat rose in waves, catching the flour dust in a ghostly shimmer. He slid the platter into the oven's mouth, closing the clay door with a gentle tap. "The sunloaf?" the boy asked, voice reverent. "In the warm shelf," Kefri said, rising. He walked to the back alcove and returned with a golden brown round, its top glazed with honey and pressed with the symbol of Ta's shrine. It smelled of cloves and spelt and the faint tang of sour fruit. As Kefri wrapped it in oiled cloth, he spoke as if reciting a prayer. "Wheat from the eastern bank. Ground before sunrise. Water from the temple well. Honey from the priest's own jar." Senmut stared at it, wide-eyed. "And the gods will eat it?" Kefri placed it gently into the tray. "They will smell it. That is enough." Outside, a breeze whispered through the crack in the door, bringing with it the scent of river silt and cool reeds. "Wait a little while," Kefri said, sitting beside the boy. "The barley cakes will be ready soon. There's no rush when it comes to offerings." Senmut nodded. His gaze remained on the oven, its glow reflected in his eyes. And there, beneath the quiet roof, with the night deepening around them and the gods waiting patiently in their sanctuaries, baker and temple boy sat in gentle silence, watching the dough become bread. The shadows on the courtyard wall lengthen as the sun, now nearing the horizon, pours its warm bronze light across the village. Inside the baker's home, a soft clatter echoes from the storage room, earthenware lids being lifted, clay jars being nudged aside, the muted thud of amphorae shifted gently on straw-padded shelves. The cool darkness here holds the scents of ground emmer, dried dates, and yesterday's dough, each aroma layered with the faintest trace of ash and linen. Biquette, the eldest daughter, stoops to inspect a sealed pot of honey. Her fingers are dusted with flour, and a fine sheen of perspiration clings to her brow from the heat still radiating through the walls. She removes the pot's clay seal with care and peers inside, tilting it slightly to see the golden contents glisten. It will be used sparingly, perhaps to sweeten a few loaves for a neighbor who has just given birth, or to reward a child's helpful hands after a long day. Outside, the soft thunk of a wooden pestle rises in rhythm. Biquette's younger brother, Hori, is crouched beside a mortar, grinding caraway seeds with quiet determination. He is not old enough to be entrusted with fire or blades, but this task is his alone. The sound he makes is not loud, yet in the stillness of early evening, it becomes a soothing heartbeat within the household. Each twist and press releases the warm, almost peppery scent of the spice, a familiar fragrance, grounding and ancient. In the center of the main room, their mother kneels beside the low hearth. The fire has been stoked into a steady burn, the coals glowing with a slow, patient heat. She checks the dome-shaped clay oven, tapping the side lightly to listen for the dry ring of readiness. The oven has been used for years, and she knows its moods, how long it holds warmth, when it will cook too quickly, when it needs to rest. Tonight, she has shaped a mixture of coarsely milled flour and date pulp into small, flat cakes. They are stacked nearby, covered with a damp cloth to keep them from drying before their turn with the fire. One by one, she slides the cakes onto the hot stones inside the oven, her hand wrapped in a thick fold of woven reed cloth. The hiss of dough meeting heat is faint but satisfying. As she works, the scent begins to rise, sweetness from the dates, earthiness from the grain, and a whisper of smoke from the well-used oven floor. The smell drifts through the home, slipping into doorways, curling into the fabric of tunics and the creases of palms. Biquette hums softly as she arranges bundles of herbs on a shelf above the hearth, mint, marjoram, and dried fenugreek. The gentle crackle of the fire and her quiet tune form a lullaby of motion, ancient and unhurried. From the far corner of the room, their grandfather watches with a small smile. His sight is dim now, but he knows the motions by heart. He recognizes the tempo of this hour, the rustle of woven baskets, the flick of fingers brushing flour from a table, the rhythm of dough being flattened, the low murmur of voices. It is the same music his mother once made, and hers before her. In the warmth of the firelight, it is as though time itself folds gently inward, and the present moment glows like an ember held in the palm. Outside, the Nile murmurs softly beyond the garden wall. A heron lifts from the shallows, its wings gilded by the sun's last rays. And inside the baker's home, the family moves quietly around their tasks, spice and fire, grain and memory, each motion another line in a poem written not with words, but with touch and time. The path that led away from the bakery curved gently past low earthen homes, their flat roofs glowing golden in the last sunlight. Clouds of dust stirred around Huyas' feet as he walked, the air scented with the dryness of sand and the faint sweetness of crushed dates. His fingers still smelled faintly of wheat flour and the scorched stone of the oven, though he had long washed them. Evening prayers had passed, and now the village softened into a hush that was neither work nor sleep. Huyas' steps slowed as he approached a shaded alcove near the water seller's empty stall. Beneath an awning woven of faded palm fronds, a slender figure sat hunched over a wooden frame. The low rustle of thread spoke more than words. Here was Merit, the weaver of linen, whose fingers moved as if guided by memory older than speech. He greeted her quietly. "Evening, Merit." She did not look up at first, only nodded slightly, her headscarf falling forward as she continued threading the shuttle through the taut warp strings. "Evening, Huya. You smell of barley crust again." He smiled. "And you of flax dust and sun." They both chuckled, softly. These were old jokes between them, passed through the seasons like the floodwaters of the Nile. The woven linen on her lap was a pale blue, dyed from crushed woad leaves and sky, an expensive hue, likely commissioned by the overseer's wife. Each thread shimmered slightly in the low light. "You'll finish that tonight?" Huya asked. "I must. Her servant waits for it before sunrise." Merit's voice was even, but the quiet strain behind it was familiar. There were no idle hands in the village tonight, not when grain had to be stored before the next moon, not when debts to the temple loomed so large. He sat beside her on a low brick ledge, the rough clay cool beneath him. Around them, insects chirped from the rushes, and distant frogs croaked from irrigation ditches. A boy ran past with a goat on a string, barefoot and laughing, fading into the dusk. Merit paused her work for a moment and reached into a reed basket at her side. From it she drew a piece of rough, unfinished cloth, a scrap too small for tunics or shrouds. "Do you remember this?" she asked, holding it up. Its edges were uneven, and its threads misaligned. It was the first thing she had ever woven. "I do," Huya said. "I remember you spilled the dye on your sandals trying to color it. And you helped me scrub them clean with sour beer," she added, her eyes finally meeting his. They were a dark brown, flecked with amber, as if the sun itself had left traces behind. For a moment, the years peeled back, and they were young again, two curious souls learning to shape the world with their hands, one with fire and flower, the other with loom and thread. Then, gently, the moment passed. She folded the cloth and returned it to the basket. "Sometimes I miss how small the world was then," she said. Huya nodded. "Before the taxes. Before we feared the harvest." They sat in companionable silence for a while. Overhead, the stars began to bloom one by one in the darkening sky. The Pleiades rose first, like scattered grains thrown across black linen. Merit resumed her weaving, her fingers moving with tireless rhythm. "Go home, Huya," she said at last. "Your oven will want tending in the night." "I'll go soon," he replied. "But I'll stay until the next thread is drawn." And so he did, watching her hands move, listening to the whispers of flax against wood, and letting the hush of the evening settle around them like a warm, invisible blanket. In the quiet of the Nile Valley, not all love was spoken aloud. Some was woven in linen. Some was baked into crust. And some sat, simply, between two people as the stars rose above the palms. The last loaf is drawn from the oven with a reverent care, its crust singing a quiet crackle in the warm air. It is a small song of completion, a hymn to fire and time. Bouquet, her arms dusted with a veil of flour, leaned slightly on the long wooden paddle, pausing in the waning heat to breathe in the scent that fills the space, grain and ash, hearthstone and earth. The evening is deeper now. The sun, though long set, still glows faintly across the horizon in tones of ochre and burnt rose. Shadows lengthen, soft and uncertain. They drift like smoke along the mud brick walls and curl in the hollows of cooling vessels. From the courtyard, the murmuring of night insects begins their chorus, tentative at first, then more insistent. It is a sound as old as the flood itself. Bouquet slides the bread onto a reed mat beside the others, all arranged with gentle precision. Each round bears its own subtle variation, some domed higher, others split slightly where the crust rose with eager hunger. She does not judge them. Bread, like people, carries its own story from the oven. Some blister, some remain smooth. All are welcome at the table. She kneels, slowly, before the cooling loaves, cupping her hands around a small vessel of barley water. Steam rises faintly. She drinks not in haste, but in rhythm with the fading day. There is time now, time to cool the body as the bread cools, to let the quiet settle in her bones. The clay oven, too, must rest. She opens its stone door to release the last of its fire. A soft exhale of warmth rolls over her legs as she crouches, and for a moment, she watches the embers as they dim. No longer roaring or fierce, they now whisper with a red hum, like coals remembering the sun. She places a stone over the opening, not to seal it, but to let it sleep. In a corner of the bakery rests a wooden rack with jars of ground herbs, fenugreek, coriander, dried garlic. Becky plucks a pinch of each and mixes them with oil in a low bowl. She will brush it over the bread once it cools fully. Her fingertips know the motion by feel, not thought. Each loaf receives the touch like a blessing, a final gesture of completeness. Outside, a neighbor's child laughs briefly, then is hushed by a gentle voice. Somewhere beyond the street, a flute plays. The music reaches her in fragments, soft and irregular like petals falling into water. She recognizes the tune. It is old, a hymn to Tauret, the protective goddess of the home. A song often sung to ease the night into being. Becky smiles faintly. Not many sing it now. She moves to a low bench and sits, wiping her brow with a damp cloth. The door of the bakery is left ajar, and through it she watches the stars begin to scatter themselves across the sky, one by one. The Nile is not visible from here, but she knows it is out there, moving in silence, mirroring the heavens with its shifting glass. Tonight, no more dough will be needed, no more heat stoked. The work is done. The bread is whole. The fire is quiet. The night, once a thing to be delayed, is now an old friend stepping gently into the room. And so she waits with the loaves, not for anything in particular, but because this moment deserves no rush. The hush between the shaping of bread and the start of dreams is its own sacred ritual. In the silence, the scent of warm grain lingers like a memory, and the bakery, still breathing softly, holds on to the last of the day's light. Becky moves slowly now, not from weariness, but from reverence. The bread has cooled, its crusts firmed, its scent mellowed into a quiet hum that clings to the walls and floor. She lifts each loaf with care, 2 at a time, and places them into baskets lined with woven rush. The baskets are dark from long use, their handles smooth from fingers passing over them morning after morning, season after season. Some of these loaves will be taken to the temple at first light, a small offering in thanks for the grain and the hands that shaped it. Others will go to the family next door, who had no flour this week. The rest are for the house, enough to feed her kin, the workers on the roof, and the child who comes to sweep the walkway in exchange for bread and figs. There is a loaf she sets aside, one with a slightly burned edge and a deep split down the middle. Not a failure, just not a first choice. She places it near the doorway on a low stone shelf. Tomorrow, it may go to the old woman who sits at the well, her hands curled with age, always watching. The woman never asks for bread. She simply sits, and the village answers her silence. Becky sprinkles a fine dusting of ash across the clay floor near the oven, then sweeps it gently into a basket. The ash is not waste. Tomorrow, it will be used to scrub pots, to enrich the soil of a sun-dried garden patch behind the house, to seal jars against pests. Even the remnants of fire have a place in the cycle. She stands a moment at the threshold of the bakery, her hand resting on the doorframe. The door is shaped from palm wood, darkened by sun and soot. A small carving sits at eye level, a lotus in bloom, worn nearly flat. It was carved by her brother years ago, before he left for the quarries near the Red Land. She traces it with her finger, not to remember him, she does that already, but to feel again the line of his blade, the moment it bit into the grain of wood and made something soft. Then, with practiced fingers, she slides the wooden door mostly shut, leaving just enough space for air to pass. A bakery should breathe even at night. The courtyard beyond is quiet. A cat slinks along the wall, pauses, and meets Bakay's eyes. For a heartbeat, they simply regard one another, two creatures moving through dusk with purpose and poise. Then the cat vanishes into shadow, the sound of its paws muffled by dust. Inside the house, a single lamp burns low. Her aunt must be awake, perhaps stirring a pot of lentils for the morning meal, or laying out dried dates for tomorrow's workers. Bakay does not call out. She lets the quiet remain whole. Instead, she walks slowly to the corner of the courtyard where a small stone bench rests beneath a fig tree. The tree is not yet in full fruit, but its leaves shiver gently in the night breeze, casting long fingers of shade against the wall. She sits, setting the basket of bread beside her. She doesn't think of the day behind her. She doesn't think of the day ahead. She listens, to the tree, to the quiet hum of the lamp, to the unseen movement of the Nile in the distance. She listens, because the bread has no voice, but it carries its story nonetheless. And this is the end of it, not the end of work, or of hunger, or of fire, but the end of the rhythm that began this morning with cold stone and silence, and which now closes with warmth and stillness. Tomorrow will bring another sunrise. Another grinding of grain, another knot of dough, another oven to feed. But tonight, there is only this, the cool air, the scent of baked earth, and a basket of bread that waits to be shared. And that is enough. The sun had long vanished behind the western ridge of palm trees, leaving behind only a faint breath of lavender in the air. Now, with dusk softened into night, the streets of the village were no longer pathways of noise and bustle, but quiet veins of stillness, pulsing only with the soft shuffle of sandals and the hush of reeds whispering in the breeze. Menesu adjusted the basket on his shoulder. It was lighter now, filled only with a few loaves wrapped carefully in linen cloth, still warm from the oven's final embers. These were not for the market. They were not for coin. They were for the gods. For the moon. For the silence. He walked slowly, each step measured, as though he were treading upon a sacred rhythm he could not name. The village houses were drowsy now, square mud brick walls lit only by the occasional oil lamp flickering behind a reed blind. Somewhere in the distance, a goat bleated once, then was quiet. Beyond that, the faint hum of a priest's chant curled upward like a thread of incense in the air. The path to the temple was not long, but Menesu took his time. Along the banks of a narrow irrigation canal, frogs called softly to one another, and water bugs skated the surface like spirits. He passed under the drooping leaves of a sycamore tree, its thick branches silhouetted against a sky now dusted with stars. He did not often speak during this walk. No one did. It was a path that villagers rarely used at night, save for those called to make small offerings, a bundle of dates, a folded piece of woven linen, or, in Menesu's case, a few humble loaves kneaded with prayers. As he approached the outskirts of the village, the land flattened into the open forecourt of the small local temple. Unlike the grand sanctuaries of Thebes or Memphis, this one was modest, a single stone gateway flanked by mud brick walls and two simple pillars carved with lotus motifs. Even so, it stood with quiet authority, surrounded by low-standing tamarisk trees and the soft scent of crushed desert grass underfoot. An old priest stood at the entrance, cloaked in a linen robe so fine and white it caught the moonlight like river mist. He bowed his head slightly as Menesu neared, and Menesu mirrored the gesture. No words passed between them. None were needed. He stepped past the pylons and into the inner court. Here, the air changed. It was cooler, wrapped in the hush of ancient breath and the weight of stone. The walls were painted, faint figures of the gods Nut and Khonsu watched overhead, their painted arms curved above the stars. A single oil lamp flickered before a low altar, casting long shadows of ibis and jackal statuettes. Menesu stepped forward and knelt. Carefully, he placed the wrapped loaves onto the offering slab. He whispered something, not a chant, not a formal prayer, but something softer. Something between breath and gratitude. Behind him, the priest began a quiet litany, his voice weaving through the columns like wind through wheat. There was no audience, no spectacle. Only this quiet transaction of reverence, one man's humble bread for the moon's unseen blessing. For a long moment, Menesu remained kneeling. He thought of the grain in his hands earlier that morning, of the sound it made under the stone mill. Of the warmth of the oven bricks. Of the way his daughter's laughter echoed off the courtyard walls when the flour puffed into her hair. He thought of how much of his life was made of bread, not just the eating of it, but the shaping. The waiting. The giving. Then he stood, slow and silent. The priest gave a soft nod, his chant fading like the tail of a comet. Menesu stepped back into the night, the scent of warm loaves lingering faintly on his fingertips. The moon was high now, and the Nile shimmered in silver silence. The sun had dipped low now, casting the Nile in molten gold. Shadows lengthened across the bakery's courtyard as the distant bleating of goats and the creaking of ox carts wove themselves into the hush of evening. By this hour, the rhythm of the day had slowed, but there was still a quiet kind of labor to be done, less frantic than the kneading and stoking of fires, yet just as essential. This was the hour of the grain ledger. Ake emerged from the inner room, wiping his hands on a folded length of linen. The scent of flour still clung to his skin, but the pace of his breath was no longer hurried. With him he carried a smooth wooden tablet coated in beeswax, a scribe's tool, though far humbler than those found in a temple or the palace workshops. This was his register, his reckoning with grain. He settled on a low stool beside a clay oil lamp. Its wick had only just been lit, casting a warm and flickering glow over the small nook where records were kept. His daughter Hennet, barely more than 12, joined him with a pot of diluted beer and a reed pen she had sharpened herself. Though still young, she had a steady hand and a quiet patience that made her suited to this task. "Begin with the scribe's portion," Ake said, his voice calm, more ritual than command. Hennet nodded and traced the first line. Each day, a portion of grain was set aside for the official scribe who visited monthly. Not merely as compensation, but as insurance, a favor held in grain against misread weights or overlooked miscounts. Together they worked through the tally, wheat from the eastern granary, barley traded in from a farmer across the river, sacks taken in payment from neighbors who had no deben of silver but whose loaves still depended on Ake's ovens. The numbers were not large, but they bore the weight of survival. As she recorded, Hennet glanced occasionally at her father, his brow furrowed in concentration. She knew he read more than numbers. He saw patterns, when one neighbor's offering grew smaller, when a trader missed his promised delivery. These subtleties told a story more vital than even the flour-dusted loaves cooling behind them. "Meru's grain is down again," he murmured, pointing at a narrow line. "Third time this season." Hennet dipped her pen again. "His wife is ill," she said softly. "The healer told mother yesterday." Ake exhaled, his hands resting flat on the tablet's edge. "Then he'll need bread, not less of it." This was the unspoken contract of the neighborhood. No oath carved in stone or sealed with rings, but a net of quiet responsibilities, strung between the houses and shops and ferry boats. Bread, when shared, became more than food. It became presence. Assurance. A kind of whispered promise that no one would be left alone with hunger. The breeze carried in the scent of evening reeds, cool and tinged with moisture. Outside, the last dregs of light painted the mud brick walls in burnt orange. Inside, Ake flipped the tablet to the next section, where expenses were carved more loosely, scraps traded, debt owed, the record of a borrowed amphora or a missing jug. Hennet paused to rub her hand, her fingers stiff from holding the pen. Ake noticed, and gently set the stylus aside. "That's enough for today," he said. "Even Pharaoh doesn't count his grain at nightfall." She smiled, closing the cover of the tablet. He tousled her hair and rose slowly, joints cracking softly in the quiet. From across the courtyard, the low murmur of his wife's voice could be heard as she prepared lentil stew by the fire. In the shadows behind them, the loaves cooled in orderly rows, puffed and golden. The ledger was closed for the day. But in its neat, waxy lines lay the delicate balance of the household, the unseen architecture of care, fairness, and survival. Bread was made from flour, yes, but also from watching, noticing, remembering. The final rays of sun have long since faded beyond the palms, leaving only the hush of twilight draped across the land like a well-woven linen shawl. Beyond the cluster of mud brick homes, the tamarisk trees whisper in the river's breeze, their thin leaves rustling gently like papyrus being turned in a careful hand. A thin sliver of moon begins its rise, pale and curved like a sickle, casting silver threads across the still water of the canal. Tepi sits on a low stone near the bakery's rear wall, her back to the warm bricks that have cooled now with the coming of night. Her eyes are on the stars, scattered softly overhead in a sky so vast it feels like it might cradle the entire world. The scent of flower still clings faintly to her skin, mingling with traces of date smoke from the hearth. Her hands rest in her lap, empty now, but still shaped by the rhythm of kneading and shaping, of folding and tending. From across the yard, the quiet jingle of a donkey's harness floats toward her. A neighbor, late in returning from the grain storehouses, waves in passing, silhouetted by a flickering torch at his doorway. No words are exchanged. None are needed. There is a deep comfort in this silence, a shared understanding that lingers like the scent of warm bread on cool air. Inside, her apprentice has long since swept the last of the flour from the clay floor. The oven door is shut tight, coals resting quietly beneath the domed stones. The baskets have been stacked, the tools rinsed and stored, the evening loaves delivered in careful bundles to nearby homes. All the work, the rushing heat and careful timing, the bustle of forming and feeding, is behind her now. This is the hour for listening, not to voices, but to the sounds that dwell beneath them. A nightjar calls softly from a beam. The reeds along the riverbank rustle with unseen movements. Somewhere far off, a wooden oar taps the side of a skiff, the hollow knock echoing faintly in the stillness. And beneath it all, the river speaks in slow, sighing syllables, pulling gently at the earth, endlessly patient. Tepi reaches for a scrap of linen resting beside her, a cloth once used for lifting loaves from the oven, now worn soft as down. She folds it in her hands, slowly, methodically, as though folding a prayer. Then she presses it to her cheek, breathing in the faint memory of smoke and grain. It is not pride she feels, nor joy, nor even relief. It is something gentler, a release, perhaps. A kind of belonging. The knowledge that she has fed her people, tended their needs with quiet hands and practiced care. That in a world of shifting sands and rising floods, there is still this, a loaf, a fire, a steady breath. And when she finally rises and turns toward the low doorway of her sleeping quarters, the moonlight follows her, casting her shadow long and soft across the dusty earth. A single oil lamp flickers in the alcove beyond the threshold, waiting like a silent friend. As she crosses that threshold, she does not look back. Not at the oven, not at the baskets, not at the field paths still glowing faintly under moonlight. Tomorrow will come with its own demands. But for now, the quiet is enough. The night holds her gently, and the grain sleeps beside the hearth. The world is still. The hush before the first light lies thick and warm across the sleeping village, like wool draped gently over shoulders. The stars linger longer now, clinging to the violet dome of the sky, reluctant to yield to the faint promise of morning. Tepi stirs before the ibis cries, before the temple boys begin their sweeping, before even the river wind wakes fully from its night-long slumber. She lies in silence for a time, listening to the slow rhythm of her own breath and the small creaks of the woven reed wall beside her. The earth is cool beneath her sleeping mat. A single mosquito whines and then disappears again into shadow. With practiced slowness, she sits upright and wraps her linen shawl around her shoulders. Her joints protest softly, not from age but from many years of rising before the stars had faded. Her hands, curled slightly from days filled with kneading and lifting, press gently against her thighs as she grounds herself. She does not yet stand. There is a quiet reverence in these earliest moments, moments where even thought has not fully formed, where the soul resides in the body like oil in a lamp, waiting for the wick's kiss of flame. She reaches beside her for the clay water jar. Its rim is cool, beaded faintly with the damp breath of the night. She pours a little into her palm, presses it to her eyelids, then her mouth, then her brow. It is not just a washing, it is a calling. A soft ritual reminder that she is again in the world, and the day will soon begin to breathe. In the faint glow of the oil lamp still flickering low on its niche, the room takes shape, the low bench where her outer robe hangs neatly folded, the small woven box with comb, beads, and dried lotus tucked inside, the corner where her sandals rest like curled cats. All simple things, all known. The familiarity is its own kind of prayer. She dons her robe and steps outside, drawing the door curtain behind her with the lightest hand. The courtyard is pale with dust and moonlight. A cool breeze moves slowly along the packed earth path, nudging at the hanging vines near the wall. Somewhere far off, a bird calls once, then silence again. Tepi crosses to the small brick shrine nestled in the corner of the courtyard wall. It is no grand altar, just a raised ledge of mud brick whitewashed with care, set with a single carved stone figure, an offering to Tauret, the protective mother goddess who watches over households and women's work. She kneels, not heavily, but with the ease of long habit. The stone beneath her knees is cold and faintly damp from the night air. From a small jar tucked beneath the ledge, she takes a pinch of ground emmer and another of dried dates. She places them carefully at the foot of the figure. The smell of the date dust is sweet and subtle, rising gently with the breeze. Tepi does not speak aloud. Her prayers are silent, wrapped in breath and memory. They are not grand requests, but small, habitual offerings, gratitude for fire that does not burn too high, for dough that rises cleanly, for strength in her shoulders and light in her eyes. For one more day of bread, and all that bread means. She lifts a small palm oil lamp from the wall hook beside the shrine. It flickers stubbornly, resisting the wick's first attempt to catch. She shields the flame with her hand and waits until it steadies. The light is soft, golden, no brighter than a star. From the shrine, she turns back toward the bakery, its bulk a darker shadow against the eastern sky. The door stands closed, but behind it, the warmth of yesterday still lingers, held like breath in a cupped hand. As she steps forward, the first feather of light begins to touch the horizon. Not gold yet, only gray, pale, and full of promise. And so begins the offering, not of incense or fine perfumes, but of labor, and heat, and flour. An offering not only to the gods, but to the living, to the mouths that will open in hunger, and the hands that will carry her bread through the awakening streets. Outside, the stars began their slow dance across the firmament, shimmering above the broad Nile like scattered barley on black silt. The breeze from the river had cooled as night deepened, brushing through the reeds in soft whispers. With the final loaves cooling and the last of the coals dying in their clay pockets, Nebaman stepped out into the evening hush, his tunic still dusted with flour, his hands rough and warm from the day's-long labors. He moved past the storage amphory, now sealed for tomorrow's kneading, and stepped barefoot into the open courtyard behind the bakehouse. The smooth earth was cool beneath his feet. From here, the soft susurrus of the Nile could be heard, a low and constant murmur, like the breathing of the gods themselves. Lamps flickered within neighboring homes, their amber light casting long shadows that wavered on mud-brick walls. Far across the fields, the frogs had begun their nighttime chorus, joined by the clicking of beetles and the occasional hoot of a distant owl. Nebaman sat on a worn stone bench beneath the fig tree, where he often paused to let the day settle. His back ached gently, but not unpleasantly, the ache of a craft well practiced. He rolled his shoulders and exhaled, watching the breath rise into the starlit dark. This was the hour of stillness, when the work no longer called, and the world around him softened like dough beneath resting cloth. A clay cup of cool barley water waited beside him, brought by his daughter before she had gone off to sleep. He drank it slowly, savoring its simplicity, the faint earthy sweetness, the thin residue of grain at the bottom. He thought of her tiny hands, of how she had once tried to shape her own miniature loaves alongside him. Now she slept in her corner mat, curled beneath linen, dreaming perhaps of river boats or dancing ibises or stories told beneath sycamores. In the distance, a crocodile splashed, a heavy, echoing thud near the reeds. But even that sound felt ancient and expected, part of the rhythm of the Nile night. Nebaman glanced upward. Orion's belt, known to him as Sa, was already climbing the eastern sky. The rising stars reminded him that another day waited, just beyond the horizon, patiently ready to unfold. Beside the fig tree, the oven's warmth still clung faintly to the air. He looked over to the low wall where tomorrow's wheat sacks lay waiting beneath linen coverings, the faint scent of grain carried faintly on the breeze. No alarms, no calls, no rush. Just the quiet turning of time in this sacred corridor between dusk and dawn. He reached down and took a small date from a bowl he had brought out earlier. It was wrinkled and sweet, and as he bit into it, he chewed slowly, tasting more than the fruit itself, tasting memory. His mother had always given him dates after the market walk, telling stories of how they were kissed by Ra's own sunlight. That taste, unchanged after all these years, held her voice within it still. The baker's gaze turned inward for a moment. He did not think of pharaohs or scribes or scrolls, only of fire and flour, of how much the world could be known through hands. There was no praise or procession for his labors, only the deep, steady satisfaction that tomorrow, another family would eat. That someone would tear a piece of bread, dip it in oil, and not go hungry. The river hummed its lullaby as the moon climbed, pale and perfect. Nebaman stood, gathering the empty bowl and cup, and stretched once more. He whispered a quiet blessing toward the water, for fish, for harvest, for rest, and turned back toward the shadowed doorway of his home. The night, like bread left to rise, would deepen in silence. The fire has long since calmed into a steady, low glow. What once roared now hums in quiet strength, its coals deep red beneath soft white ash. The oven's mouth, cracked slightly open, exhales warm breaths into the stillness of the bakery. Kamwaset kneels before it one last time, not to tend or feed, but to listen. He watches the final batch of barley flatbreads begin to brown, their thin edges curling ever so slightly from the baking tiles. The loaves are quiet now. No sizzling. No bubbling. Just a faint hiss as the last of the moisture is drawn from the dough. It is a sound he knows better than any, like reeds brushing gently in the wind, or linen being folded in a still room. Outside, the murmur of the village is fading. Distant footsteps, a faraway shout of children being called home, the bray of a tethered donkey, it all grows dimmer. The Nile, vast and unknowable, lies hidden in the dark, carrying its secrets silently to the sea. Within these thick mud brick walls, the world has shrunk to embers and earth. A single oil lamp flickers near the clay wall, casting shadows that stretch and soften. Beside it, a reed basket of cooled loaves rests, draped in woven flax to keep them warm. The scent of toasted grain, smoke, and fresh bread fills every inch of the air. Kamwaset moves slowly now. He rolls the heavy stone lid back over the flour jar. He brushes the last traces of bran from the grinding slab with a soft palm leaf. Every motion is ritual, a closing of the day, a sealing of memory. His body aches from the hours of bending, lifting, and kneading, but it is a familiar ache. Not unwelcome. Not sharp. Just the weight of a day honestly spent. In a corner, his cat, Tauret, yawns widely and stretches, curling near the oven's warmth. Her eyes blink lazily, half aware of her master's movements. She has known this rhythm for years, knows the night will end with quiet sweeping, a ladle of leftover barley broth poured into a chipped bowl, and the flickering out of the lamp. The baker draws a linen wrap across his shoulders. He steps toward the doorway and peers outside. The stars have emerged in great flocks, wheeling high above the palm fronds. Somewhere nearby, a water wheel creaks gently. The smell of damp river reeds rides the night breeze. He says nothing. There is nothing to say. Turning back, he crouches beside the oven once more. With a flat, curved paddle, he draws out the last loaves, browned perfectly, fragrant, dusted with faint flour rings. He sets them carefully on a woven mat to cool, brushing off stray ash with the back of his hand. The heat lingers, not just in the oven, but in the walls, the floor, the very air. It is a heat that comforts rather than stifles, an old heat, born of labor and patience. Kamwaset sits beside the embers, knees drawn up, hands resting quietly in his lap. He does not speak, nor hum, nor move much at all. He simply watches the red coals breathe beneath their soft gray veil, blinking like sleepy eyes. Outside, the wind rustles through the thatch. Inside, all is still, and the baker, surrounded by silence, sits at the heart of it all. His final loaves rest beneath a light cloth, cooling in silence. Kamwaset stands at the doorway again, arms crossed over his chest, listening. The sounds of the village have faded to nothing more than whispers, the low cough of a night guard near the granary, the clink of a pot being lowered into the courtyard well. Above, the sky is a deep indigo, stars sewn in uneven rows like beads on a woven collar. He steps into the night with care. In one hand he holds a small woven dish, upon it 3 broken crusts, pieces saved from the very first loaves of the evening, still warm with the memory of fire. These are not for man or beast. They are for the gods, for the spirits, for the air and earth and Nile that give and take in equal measure. His bare feet pad softly across the cool packed earth. The grain bins are quiet, sealed for the night. The clay pots near the wall sweat lightly with stored water. Beyond the bakery's shaded overhang, a small niche is cut into the wall, a hollow space no taller than his knee. It is here he places the dish. Kamwaset does not kneel. He does not speak. But he lingers. The offering is simple. No oils. No incense. Just bread, cracked and humble, fragrant still. It will be gone by morning, carried off by ants, sparrows, or the breeze itself. But the act of giving, that lingers far longer than any crumb. Back inside, the oil lamp casts its slow flicker across the clay floor. Its flame dances in the reflection of a polished shard of bronze set in the wall. Camewasset pauses to look into it, not out of vanity, but for familiarity. The face that stares back is shadowed, worn, calm. He does not judge it. He merely notes its presence and continues. He retrieves a small jar from a high shelf, honey steeped with herbs, meant not for customers but for moments such as these. He uncorks it gently and dips a reed stick into the golden syrup, letting a single drop fall onto the base of the lamp, where it hisses faintly and sweetens the air. A modest gesture, something he learned from his mother, who in turn learned it from her grandmother. Taweret, the cat, stirs and pads silently toward him. He lets her nuzzle against his shin, her tail flicking in slow contentment. She'll sleep in the warmest corner tonight, belly full from crusts and quiet company. The baker begins his final sweep. The long-handled palm broom whispers across the floor, stirring up a faint mist of flour and ash. He works in widening spirals, gathering the day's dust into the heart of the room. There, he kneels once more and lifts it with cupped hands, depositing it carefully into a small pit behind the oven, where the waste of many nights lives in soft, gray stillness. It is not thrown away. It is returned. He wipes his hands on the hem of his linen kilt and breathes deeply. The scent of bread, fire, sweat, and earth blends into something ancient and oddly comforting, like the smell of old temples or the hidden alcoves of tombs where time barely breathes. Finally, he lowers the wick of the oil lamp. Darkness does not fall sharply. It thickens slowly, like dye soaking into cloth. The shadows return to their corners, the red glow of the oven softens to mere memory, and the silence becomes full and round, like the belly of a pregnant ewe. Camewasset does not hurry. He sits once more, beside the cold loaves and the sleeping cat, and lets the darkness settle in layers. There is nothing left to do. The bread is made, the fire has spoken, and the night, vast and still, receives him like a folded cloth placed neatly on the shelf. The last embers of the fire flicker low, sending brief orange pulses across the inside of the now shadowed bakery. The stone walls, warm from hours of heat, radiate a final comfort as the night settles in. Amo sits near the hearth, his legs crossed, hands folded loosely in his lap. For a long while, he watches the ashes drift and fall, like desert dust carried by dreams. Outside, the village hums with silence. From a distant courtyard, the sound of a reed flute briefly curls through the air, a boy practicing, perhaps, or a father lulling his child to sleep. The Nile itself is still, reflecting the moon with a softness that blurs its edges. Somewhere in the darkness, a heron lifts into the sky, wings barely whispering. Amo steps outside, stretching. The coolness touches his skin and makes him feel briefly weightless. He looks toward the riverbank, where the rows of wheat now sleep, their heads bowed. Even grain, it seems, listens to the moon. The scent of baked barley and flour lingers on his hands. It is a scent older than memory, a scent that will outlast kings and wars and time itself. He draws a long breath, then turns toward his home. Inside, his wife is already asleep. A lamp glows faintly by the doorway, casting gentle shadows across the woven mat. He lies beside her without a word, listening to the pulse of night, the murmur of frogs, the rustle of reeds, the quiet tick of his own breath. Another day has passed. The loaves are cooled, the people fed, the grain stored safely, and beneath the stars, Amos closes his eyes, the piece of bread and silence wrapping around him like a warm linen sheet. Bottom of form.